Gentlemen, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good. Glad to be back for another round.
Well,
Awesome.
Happy to be here.
The topic is declamations. For those unfamiliar with it, what exactly is a declamation?
So these are basically mock trial exercises. Well, the most common type of them are mock trial exercises where you'd get somebody to, you'd give them some sort of situation and they'd be asked to give a speech on one side or the other side. These got used in the educational system. This is sort of like the capstone for the educational system. This is what you learned before you graduated and became a functioning member of upper class society. They also became a popular art form where they would have declamation contests. You'd get, a collection of famous speakers in, and the audience would shout out topics for them, and then they'd come up with speeches off the top of their heads for one side or the other side. And each one would try to one up the other declaimers in the group. It's great fun for the whole family,
What I would add to that is that in addition to what we would call judicial oratory, defense speeches and prosecution speeches, which were one of the most popular of the declamations that we have, there was also the other two branches of classical oratory, which was deliberative, which was essentially political speeches that advocate for a course of action, as well as what we call epidactic speeches, which are basically like panegyrics or praise of, a ruler or a city or even your cat, right? So there's a lot of different possibilities for the different ways you can use public speaking and do something creative with it. The other thing I would add is it's often been described by D.A. Russell, who wrote kind of the book on Greek declamation, several decades ago. He calls it the toy model of oratory. In other words, as a part of the educational system, this was sort of like a no stakes kind of way of practicing, a full judicial or deliberative speech without any sort of, legal or political consequences, right? And the other and most important thing was that one of the priorities in writing these mock speeches was it wasn't just argue from this position, but also argue as a certain character. That's the other thing. You had to persuasively make an argument that somebody of that particular type of character or person from history or mythology even would give. And so partly because a big part of ancient rhetoric and even in jurisprudence was that arguments based on character were counted more than they would in modern legal systems where give more priority to actual evidence, right? But that's just the tip of the iceberg of this topic.
Though declamations predate the Second Sophistic, they really come of their own during the Second Sophistic. And I was just doing some preparation for the show, reading some of Tim Whitmarsh's work on the Second Sophistic. He really makes the point that epidactic speeches, especially, were a way of asserting Greek identity in a colonized Roman world. As Kenneth, as you point out, there are some vast differences between the Roman aspect of doing declamations versus the Greek. Tell us more about this.
So I think one of the biggest things is, declamation started in Greece, but it's a little bit strange because all of our earliest declamation that we actually have is Roman. We have a whole lot of early in the Roman declamation stuff. So like Cicero is sort of like Cicero's lifetime is when declamation starts to become popular at Rome. And then it sort of takes off from there in the early empire. It starts as a sort of copy of Greek, but it very, very quickly, Roman declamation becomes its own specific thing. It sort of assumes that you're talking to the Roman Senate a lot of the time when you're doing this, especially when you're giving the non-judicial speeches. The judicial speeches have a lot of overlap with Roman law in particular. One of the points that I think probably demonstrates the best how the Romans altered Greek declamation to fit their own specific scenarios is their discussions of tyrants. Tyrants are a stock figure in both Greek and Roman declamation. But in Roman declamation, they are extremely one-dimensional. Like every tyrant you talk about does the same sets of things. They rob temples, they steal personal property, they perform extrajudicial murders, and they rape young women. Like, this is every tyrant. At least 3 of the 4 of those things, if they talk about it, that's what they do. there aren't very many good tyrants. I mean, like, we don't think about tyrant as a positive term in general, but from the Greek standpoint, a tyrant isn't necessarily a bad thing. The Romans, however, it is. It's part of their, no kings ever again sort of thing that the Romans have going on throughout their entire history. So it's a very, very negative thing in Roman declamation. But the weird thing is, because almost all of this declamation happens in the imperial period, but, like, they had the emperor, the declaimers feel like they can't actually talk that much about tyrants in fear of angering the emperor. There's actually several stories of declaimers who got in trouble with the emperor for talking too much about tyrants.
These speeches, this type of education where you're replicating the feeling of still being in the Roman Republic, where you have the political context where you can have these types of speeches, is part and parcel with the conceit in the early Roman Empire that the emperors would kind of at least pay lip service to a lot of the trappings of the Republic, right? They would dress like a fellow senator. They wouldn't flaunt their power too much. So the Roman declamation and education system was a way of kind of replicating among the upper classes, the senatorial classes, that feeling that we are still, in the Republic.
Russell uses the term Sophistopolis, and as the Greek city that all of the Greek declamation happens in, there's a similar sort of city in Roman declamation. It's Rome, but it's like the mythical Republican Rome that we're talking about.
And then on the Greek side, the Sophistopolis, it's basically classical Athens, which becomes sort of the model for kind of the cultural and political locus of Greek identity under the Roman Empire. So you have all of these political and judicial speeches where you assume that the Athenian legal system is the current legal system. Or if you are giving a speech from the point of view of an historical character, those are most often people like Demosthenes and other Athenians.
On the Roman side, one of the things that I find kind of interesting is that the Greeks actually do a whole lot more in Greek declamation of the, like, pretend you're this specific person. The Romans, perhaps because of their legal system as well, think that in general, the speaker is an unnamed advocate for that person. The Roman legal system had advocates. You were expected to, hire up to 3 people to speak your case for you. Whereas the Athenian legal system, you had to give your own speech. If you were on trial, you were the one giving the speech.
Which is why in at least our surviving examples of Greek declamation, we have a much more of what we would call the ethical declamations, which were, ethopoiei, which is basically, you're ventriloquizing a certain stock character. And often these were stock characters that were derived from new comedy. That was an early Hellenistic form of Athenian literature by poets like Menander. And that's where we get some of the stock character types like the miser, like, the misanthrope, the braggart soldier, and all of these. And so basically the idea was that in the Greek context, these kind of very interesting and, almost entertaining characters, right, were speaking on their own behalf. And so part of the challenge was to faithfully portray that character. What would a person with this type of personality argue in this situation in order to be persuasive? And that's where we get into lots of interesting situations and contradictions where you have someone who's like this misanthropic or country bumpkin farmer who wants nothing to do with like polite society, yet they are arguing very rhetorically, not flowery necessarily, but very complex arguments that you wouldn't expect somebody like that to devise. I think this might lead us to something that Kenneth actually knows a lot more about, and that's some of the theoretical models behind teaching how to argue in these situations, which the Greeks call stasis theory and the Romans call status theory.
Okay, so our biggest work on basically all of Roman declamation is Quintilian. He was the first person given the title of the official imperial rhetorician. He wrote an absolutely gigantic work called the Institutio Oratorii that basically details the entire life cycle of an orator, from like, this is how you teach an infant, the letters, to this is how you know when it's time to retire from oratory. and everything in between. About half of it is, this is how you set up, you come up with the arguments for, and you lay out a speech of whatever sort you're talking about. It's extremely detailed. It's one of those texts that I had someone on a conference panel with me once came up to me after I'd finished talking about Quintilian and said to me, I have to admit the only way that I've ever used Quintilian is looking up certain words in it and then reading the 3 paragraphs that I wanted to know about it. And I think that's how a lot of scholars use Quintilian, because his work is actually very, very long and detailed. But there's so much diverse information in it that everybody can find at least something that's interesting to them in it, but nobody wants to read the entire thing. There are also 2 different collections of declamations that are ascribed to Quintilian. The minor declamations, which are probably not Quintilian, but they almost definitely come from his school and were probably written within about 20 or 30 years of his death. They may have been notes taken from his lectures, possibly, but probably not written by him. And then there's the major declamations, which are only fully fleshed out Roman declamations, which are also ascribed to Quintilian, but nobody thinks they were actually written by Quintilian.
This is not an uncommon thing that would happen with ancient literature, where there's the master, right? And then there's a bunch of writings from his school or, successors to his school, but they either intentionally or by mistake, a lot of those writings would be ascribed to the master in order to lend them the authority of being a classic, right? So this happened with Aristotle a lot, and it happens with Galen in medical texts, and it really goes back to perhaps the whole idea that Pythagoras did all of these writings that are attributed to him because this is by Pythagoras, this must be great wisdom and everything. So.
Yeah, I mean, you write a declamation that you're really, really proud of. You're like, this is really good, and you want other people to read it and copy it down and stuff. So you say, oh yeah, I found this new declamation by Quintilian. And then everybody's like, ooh, it's a new Quintilian declamation. Then they copy it down, and that's what happened. Our best guess is that the major declamations were probably written by at least 4 different people, and possibly as many as 9 or 10 across several centuries.
What's been coming up here is just this concept of oratory and declamation as a performance culture, whether it be in the Greek system or the Roman system. I was talking to Karen Navalli. We were talking about Lucian of Samosata, and Lucian is a sophist as well as a writer. And Lucian embodies this as well, not only in his writings, but in the prologues he would give. This is a performance culture. That's why I titled this episode the Rap Battles of Antiquity, because you would have all these elite people going to these mid-sized music hall areas to go see Herodes Atticus or whatever, do their thing. They're not only doing these declamations in a idealized Sophistopoulos world, they're doing it in an idealized Attic way of speaking. The Roman way is doing it a little bit differently. But let's just kind of explore this a little bit and, the culture of the performance of it all and how people create identity on this literal and figurative stage.
I really like the idea of the rap battles of antiquity applied there, because it gives you an idea that these weren't just pieces of literature that, people would read, and they certainly were, but the most exciting thing about them was their live performance. And the thing about ancient oratory that we lack access to was not just what the words were, but how it sounded and what it looked like. Right. And if you read Quintilian or if you read other rhetorical theorists, they'll say that the most important aspect of oratory is not so much the diction, it's not so much the argument, it's the delivery. It's how you use your voice, the pitch, right, the modulation of it. It's how you use gestures. It's how you use movement. It's like, reading the script of a Greek tragedy versus actually watching it performed. Right. And so this was what people would put on display, these sophists like Aristides and Herodes Atticus and others, and some in competition as well. And, not just in a competition, there were also sophists who would go around and actually improvise these speeches. Right. They would basically go in and they would ask the audience, OK, give me a character to speak from the perspective of. right? And tell me the situation that I have to argue myself out of, right? And so, yeah, you could have a situation where, like, I want you to play Pericles and I want you to give your version of the funeral oration, right? Or something like that. And they would do it.
One of my favorite stories about the performative aspect of this and the audience's engagement in it is a story about how a well-known declaimer was especially well-known for regurgitating the same delivery over and over again. And at one point, some group of the audience got together and they talked, they came up with this thing and they gave him a topic that he was really familiar with and they'd all heard before. And they started yelling out what he was saying as he was saying it.
That's in Philostratus, for the sophists. Yeah, they would jeer these people. Like in these handbooks, they emphasize this physiognomy, right? You go in and you create your presentation based on your appearance, but sometimes you can underestimate your appearance. I remember in my prep for the show reading Philostratus, he talks about a sophist who is just kind of hanging out, and then he literally does like a kickflip, and he starts just like going off and improvising on the spot. Imagine how electric that would have been, to see these people. And that's really the point that Whitmarsh makes too in his book, The Politics of Imitation, that we really only have the written word, the one side of the story. These things weren't set for all time. They were written to be debated on a public space. And your livelihood lived and died on how you presented yourself and how you could improvise.
There's a really entertaining story in Seneca the Elder where he talks about, I don't remember, there are so many names in Seneca the Elder, and we know almost nothing about most of them. A famous declaimer was watching a friend of his giving a speech in a law court, like an actual legal speech, and he was concerned that the guy was losing, and he goes around to the various, jury members and starts, talking his friend up a bit. And after the case ends and the guy wins the case, he comes up to his friend, is like, "Thanks for doing this." And the guy says, "I didn't do it for you. I just didn't want another declaimer out here." He was afraid the guy would, wash up as a lawyer and become another declaimer.
You were talking about how, yes, these declamations certainly were in some sense intended to be performed in a specific context, right, with a live audience and everything, instead of just being, literature. Though I would argue that, especially maybe later in Antiquity, where you have people like Libanius, they do also, I think, become viewed in that way as part of the kind of literary legacy of a man like Libanius, who gave, actual speeches, political speeches and panegyrics, in the politics of his day in Antioch and everything. And he had a god of letters as well. But he also has a lot of his educational literature preserved. And among those are his declamations, which, not only displayed his literary talent, but were also used as models for his students, right? A lot of these declaimers, a lot of these sophists, in addition to going on speaking tours or whatever, right, the rock stars of their day, they were private teachers. And one reason they did those speaking tours was in order to recruit students, right? Because they made their livelihood off of, families paying to send their students to study with them, right? Any vestige of public education was with certain cities had imperially endowed chairs of rhetoric or philosophy, and very few people got those. For the vast majority of sophists and philosophers and others, and doctors even, right, had private teaching and practice. And so we have a lot of these materials. And what's also great from Libanius is not only do we have the declamations, we have what are called the Progymnasmata, which is Greek for preliminary exercises. The Roman version would be the Prae Exercitationes, right? And what they show is that a declamation is the capstone, as Kenneth said, in actually a very detailed curriculum that involved a series of much smaller exercises, writing composition exercises and speaking exercises that eventually one led to the other. So for instance, there would be an exercise where you had to retell a myth, right? You had to do basic storytelling. There were exercises where you had to compare and contrast certain things, or you had to give what was called an ekphrasis, so a detailed description of something.
Or a character sketch or a moral story or those sorts of things.
Exactly. And so all of these would be different things that would build, and the declamation would be designed to showcase all of these things combined. And so Libanius, as well as other authors such as Aphthonius in Greek, and Quintilian, of course, and on the Roman side, also has not only instructions for these, but also examples of these different types of writing exercises as part of their literary oeuvre, right? And one thing I've always been interested in doing, if given the opportunity, is actually using these exercises with my own students, right? If like an ancient education course, we would sort of try to replicate these. And also rhetoric and composition courses in college are kind of the heirs to these ancient rhetorical curricula. And you'll find that there are some similarities to the point where you could probably employ some of these assignments in a modern classroom and they would be effective.
One of the things that I always found entertaining is that most people, if you tell them you're working on declamation, they then immediately ask, what is that? Except for a fairly large number of French people, because the French educational system still uses declamation in high school. It took me a bit to do this, but by about the third Frenchman I talked to, when I mentioned declamation, they're like, oh yeah, declamation. And I'm like, why do you all know this? And they're like, well, I had to do this in high school. Like, it's a normal thing.
I mean, it would make sense, and it's a lot of fun. And I think Jeremy's right. Like, bring these back into like a composition course, and this would be like amazing. I would love to hear like a class of students using Libanius's Oratio 41 to condemn the sorcerer who's brought the plague upon the city, or Pseudo Quintilian's, I forget which major declaration it is, but the one where he's arguing because the mom is mad that the son who passed away is now a ghost, a revenant coming to visit her, and the dad like got this Babylonian astrologer to get rid of her, so now she's like bringing him to court. I mean, not that it wasn't fun pretending to be like Demosthenes or whatever. And this kind of gets into something I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, because you've written quite a bit about this. It's the whole concept of sophistry as sorcery. You mentioned that it very early on became associated with what we would call in Greek magia.
So the way I talk about it is I see that there is, all the way from the beginnings of theorizing about oratory and public speaking in ancient Greece, there have always been sort of these associations with magic. I think the best place to start is one of the original rhetorical theorists of ancient Greece, which was Gorgias of Leontini, right? The same Gorgias who's in the Gorgias dialogue by Plato, but we also have works by Gorgias, and his most famous work that we have is called the Encomium of Helen. Okay, and this was written somewhere in the mid to late 400s BC. And basically, it is a defense of Helen of Troy or Helen of Sparta by basically just arguing that it wasn't actually her fault, that she didn't cause the Trojan War, which is a wonderful debate that I still have with my mythology students, right? Basically, he used this kind of argument in order to explore what is the nature of human speech and what's the nature of persuasion. And he argued that even if Helen was not forcibly abducted by Paris and taken to Troy, if he had persuaded her simply to come with him of her own accord, she is still not complicit or responsible or culpable for the Trojan War, because Gorgias argued that Paris's persuasion, his manipulation of words, was like casting a magical spell. And so if somebody bewitches somebody, they are technically made to do things non-consensually.
They're
right?
Not responsible for their actions, yeah.
Exactly. Now, Gorgias wasn't necessarily being serious with this, but he was giving this argument in order to say, I can argue anything, right? And the point was that oratory is not about what's right or wrong. It's about what you can persuade people to be right or wrong. Okay. And because of this association between persuasion and the potential to use rhetoric to commit or to advocate something that was unjust. There's been this association between rhetoric and illicit magic. This is something that also Plato deals with a lot in his dialogues as well, because he definitely has a lot of friction with the sophists. And when Socrates himself is accused of being a sophist, these accusations that he had, bewitched and corrupted his students or whatever, leads into sort of the you practice black magic territory. So that's sort of where I identified these associations in the classical period. And so what I see, especially with the Declamations of Libanius, hundreds of years later in late antiquity, is he is inheriting those associations in a new context. And he's showing that people who, like himself, who are sophists, who professionally teach people to be persuasive, can very much be viewed by what I might call the anti-intellectual elements in society as being no different than sorcerers. And at a time when Christianity was coming into the ascendancy across Libanius's lifetime, there's also the dimension of sophists and philosophers and pagans, right, all forming the same group, and that they all practice this sort of black magic in order to, argue against what is just, right?
We were talking about the second sophistic earlier. This is taken over into a body of work that is hugely influenced by the second sophistics. The Greek and Roman novels have lots of instances where Cupid is the ultimate sophist. He loves this stuff, especially in Achilles Tatius. When, spoilers, it's only been like a couple of thousand years, but in Leucopedia Cleitophon, when Cleitophon is seduced by Melite, he says that it was the sophistry as sorcery that did it. Getting to that, I think that it really showcases the insane, topsy-turvy, outlandish scenarios. And Kenneth, I know that your work deals a lot with these outlandish scenarios. So just kind of take us through, the killing of the Tyrant, the Praemia. Tell us more about this.
So my dissertation work focused on declamation speeches that center around Praemia, like these rewards. And in both Greek and Roman declamation, you get a reward for doing specific state-sponsored actions, basically. The most common of them were either killing a tyrant or becoming a war hero. But the reward was almost always whatever you asked for, which is actually an excellent way. Like, these laws would never have been written in the real world. Like, this is so vague and so broad. It's just, you can't do it in the real world. But the thing that these do is that they help work on boundaries, like boundaries in society, boundaries in the law, and what happens when they fight against each other. So, like, if the law says one thing, but, common sense and morality says something else, what do you do about it? And that's what almost all of these speeches were about. I do have to talk about Minor Declamation 306, which is probably my favorite declamation ever. It's my favorite example of absolutely crazy scenarios that lead to these sorts of things. So the scenario goes like this. There's a woman who has a husband who frequently goes on business trips. The woman gets pregnant. The man leaves on a business trip, but before he leaves, he tells the woman that when the child's born, she should expose him. So basically, leave him out in the wilderness to die. She gives birth to a son. She exposes him. The husband dies abroad, never comes back. She's the only remaining member of the family and gains all of his inheritance. Couple decades later, a young man appears claiming to be the son that she abandoned. And she denies it. There's a court case about it. But before the court case can even finish, a war breaks out. This just keeps going. The young man goes off to war, fights valiantly, and is declared a war hero. He's then given the choice of whatever he wants as a war hero. He chooses marriage to the woman. So, at first glance, this looks like, this guy is clearly after her inheritance, right? He's like, either I'll get it by being her son or by marrying her. Either one is fine with him. But it's really, really hard to argue against this in the case that the Declamation is about, which is the war hero prize to become wedded to her. Because you have to argue it in such a way that you don't use the argument that he could be her son. Because that then makes him win the other case that's still waiting.
This is one reason that I stick with Greek declamations like Libanius, where these scenarios that you are given that you have to argue out of are much simpler. Because when Kenneth describes what he just described, it's like when people describe the rules of a tabletop game to me. My blank brain just completely goes blank. Right. So with Libanius, you have a lot more less complicated situations, because partly the point is not, as Kenneth described, to kind of explore those kind of ethical contradictions with the law and everything. And it's much more focused on faithfully portraying character. And another thing that Libanius also has a lot of his kind of ethical declamations argue, which I'm not sure is so much a thing in Roman declamation, and to correct me on this, is arguing what's called a figured speech. And the idea of a figured speech is you argue one thing, but you really intend people to be persuaded of something else. And so one of the most entertaining and common types of figured speech that Libanius's characters would argue is this thing called a prosangalia. Essentially, a prosangalia literally means a self-denunciation. In other words, in Sophistopolis, suicide's illegal. And you actually have to petition the town council, the boule, to grant you permission to end your life. So a lot of these declamations that are prosangalii, that is what on the surface you are arguing. But in fact, your intent is to actually get something else. For instance, one of Libanius's most entertaining of these prosangalia is basically this misanthropic old man who is arguing for permission to commit suicide because his wife won't show up. It's very interesting because as he's talking about all the examples of how his wife is a chatterbox, he actually sort of makes her up to sound like an actual rhetorician and declaimer herself. And basically the intent is he's not actually asking for suicide, he's actually asking for a legal grant of divorce. Right.
Quintilian actually makes fun of these kinds of speeches. He actually says, this is a Greek thing, not a Roman thing. Like, in Rome, we actually do these speeches because they're important, and people do want to commit suicide without having their property given to the state, which is what would normally happen if you were rich and you committed suicide. Like, these sorts of speeches aren't figured speeches in Roman culture. They're actual things. But he's generally against considering anything a figured speech or writing figured speeches in general. And like Jeremy said, they don't really show up in Roman declamation at all.
Yeah, because just imagine like a zany scenario like Kenneth described, and then somebody would argue a figured speech out of it. That's just like the mental capacity to follow that.
You can learn. So like one of the things that I like to say is that one of the best ways to learn about a society is by what they teach their children. And that is most of what we have in Roman declamation is the teaching texts that they'd use. So like Greek declamation, we have a lot of like experienced rhetoricians and stuff, but we have a lot of teaching texts in Roman declamation. So you get a whole lot of educational materials that are teaching not just rhetoric, but also legal theory and relationships with your family. So like part of this is because these were, 12 to 16-year-old boys who were from wealthy families would be getting these. Part of the education that they also get from this is how to be a proper paterfamilias, a proper head of the family. But you also get, all kinds of cultural inculcation that happens in this, like all of these war heroes and tyrannicides are clearly meant to teach something about, what you should be doing and what's right.
And the Greek declamations, especially the ethical declamations with the characters, often also deal with relationships between fathers and sons. Again, they are largely drawing these characters from New Comedy, right? And the function of New Comedy, by showing these kind of domestic situations, were also had ethical purposes in order to get people to think about navigating these types of familial and personal relationships. So Greek declamation does have that, at least in what we have survived, as Kenneth said, is more kind of the polished speeches by the professional rhetoricians rather than more of the theoretical material and the teaching materials that kind of will result in those speeches.
Kenneth, I really love how you emphasize that these materials can really tell us something about the society. And really, whether it's Greek or whether it's Roman, the declamations, to me, seem to be a place where people can test boundaries. What do these exercises tell us about the audience and about expectations, I guess, in this society?
I'm going to give another example that's much simpler than the previous one to talk about testing boundaries. So there's a different case that has a little phrase in it that I absolutely love, which is the main reason that I remember it. But the case is basically a man goes off to war. He loses his weapons during the fighting. He finds a nearby tomb of a war hero, takes the weapons out of it, fights in battle heroically, and basically wins the battle for them, and then puts the weapons back. And then when he comes back, he's charged with tomb robbing, basically, like grave despoiling, because he took the weapons out of this tomb. But this is a much simpler case that sort of tests, like religious boundaries. So it's like, at what point is it okay to break that taboo? Is it okay to do so for the good of the state, right? And these are all open questions that they have to debate, and they're debatable on both sides, which is one of the things that I really love about declamation, is that you can argue these convincingly both directions.
I think the thing I would add to that, which is my final thoughts on this as well, is declamation is often talked about as sort of being stuck in the past. In other words, the Sophistopolis, or sort of the imaginary Republican Rome, right? This idealized space based on some romanticized vision of classical antiquity for either Greece or Rome, where you have either these characters or these sort of reborn historical figures who are acting, who are being ventriloquized here. But the thing is that I tend to think of this type of literature as performing similar functions to what maybe modern science fiction does, where obviously it's not in the past, but it's in the future, where we can have these sorts of scenarios played out where you are testing these ethical boundaries, while at the same time, this has a function for how we engage with the present, right? But we can do so in a way that is, less on the nose, less politically, divisive or sensitive, and also in a way that's entertaining and memorable, right? We can think about all sorts of Star Trek episodes that help us think about certain ethical situations because there was, the spectacle, there was the various dramatic elements that have it stick in our minds. And I think that declamation geared toward these adolescent young men, right, was a way to kind of ingrain these sort of ethical lessons and problems, in their developing, teenage brains.
Kenneth, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think Jeremy's absolutely right. This is spot on. It's a way to talk about the present in a way that's disconnected from the present, right?
Yes, absolutely. And just in my own personal studies, I also find that in the Greek and Roman novels, especially the Greek novels, because the Greek novels are set in this kind of idealized Athenian past as well. And the boundaries in terms of social status, in terms of sexuality, everything is turned on its head, and people have to experience things from different vantage points. It's still something that speaks and resonates to the human condition.
The fact that we have so much of it preserved, as Kenneth said, most traditional classicists haven't heard of declamation or don't really know anything about it, yet so much of it has been preserved, along with a lot of other material from the Second Sophistic. That's just not common knowledge. And what that tells you is that up until the past couple centuries, this literature was popular, right? It was popular through the Middle Ages, which allowed this stuff to be copied and survived, right, in both Byzantium and the Western Middle Ages. And it was also read and enjoyed throughout the early modern period as well, especially the Greek novels, certainly. And it's only in the past, couple centuries, thanks to, I think, just a lot of German scholarship in the 19th century, deciding what is proper classical literature among, the much wider amount of Greek and Roman literature that survived from antiquity. And so we're hoping to kind of renew that appreciation for why this was so popular for so long.
I actually love the connection with the Greek novels. Because I think there's a lot of very strong connections there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know which direction they go, probably both, but we've got a whole lot of the same stock figures, stock scenarios. Like, what's entertaining to people? Pirates, torn apart loves, people being sold as gladiators or slaves or whatever, right? Like, this is all fun stuff. And the Declamations do that just as much as the Greek novels do, and in many of the same ways.
I think there's lots of room for study that I'm sure is going on now for understanding identity in this period of times. This has been such a blast. I love going through all these like insane scenarios in this vibrant period of times. This has been fantastic. Thank you for sharing your time. Until next time, gentlemen, take care.